In the vast sun-scorched lands of the ancient world, a man named Abraham lived a simple life. He was a shepherd, a leader of his household, and a man who walked with a deep sense of purpose. He and his beloved wife Sarah had journeyed far from their home in Ur of the Chaldees, following a call they believed came from God. They lived in tents, their lives dictated by the seasons and the needs of their flocks. Yet, amidst the dust and the daily toil, one great sadness shadowed their days. They were old, well beyond the years of bearing children, and they had no heir to carry on their name or inherit the blessings they had been promised. One night, under a brilliant canopy of stars that seemed close enough to touch, God made a promise to Abraham. He led the old man out of his tent and told him to look up at the heavens. "Count the stars if you can," God's voice seemed to whisper on the desert wind. "So shall your descendants be." It was a promise that defied all logic, a hope that seemed impossible to grasp. How could a man so old, with a wife equally advanced in years, become the father of a nation as numerous as the stars glittering in the endless night sky? It was a question that would test the very limits of human belief. Despite the impossibility of it all, Abraham chose to believe. He held on to this divine promise, with a faith that was as vast as the desert itself. Years passed, seasons changed, and still they waited. The wait was long and often filled with doubt and human frailty, but the seed of hope had been planted in their hearts. Then, in a moment that felt like a miracle, the promise began to unfold. Against all odds and the wisdom of their time, Sarah conceived and gave birth to a son. They named him Isaac, which means he laughs, because his birth brought unimaginable joy and laughter to their old age. Isaac became the center of Abraham's world, the living, breathing proof of God's faithfulness. Every day, as Abraham watched his son grow from a baby into a strong young boy, he saw the future of his people. Isaac was not just a son, he was the fulfillment of a sacred covenant, the first star in a constellation of descendants that would one day fill the earth. He was the promise made flesh, a daily reminder that with God, nothing was truly impossible. Abraham's love for his son was immeasurable, a deep and powerful bond that was intertwined with his devotion to the God who had given him this precious gift. Just as life settled into a rhythm of peace and fulfillment, the voice of God came to Abraham again. But this time the message was not one of promise, but of a profound and heart-wrenching test. The command was simple in its words, but staggering in its meaning. "Take your son," God said, "your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." The words must have struck Abraham like a physical blow, shattering the peace of his world and plunging his heart into a darkness deeper than any desert night he had ever known. Abraham's mind must have reeled in confusion and anguish. How could this be? This was the son of the promise, the child of his old age, the very embodiment of God's covenant. To sacrifice Isaac would be to sacrifice the future God himself had guaranteed. Every instinct as a father, every fiber of his being would have screamed in protest. The request seemed to contradict the very nature of the loving God he had come to know and trust. This was a trial that went beyond mere obedience. It was a test of the soul, asking him to surrender the most precious gift he had ever received. We can only imagine the storm of emotions that raged within Abraham's heart that sleepless night. He was caught between his boundless love for his son and his absolute devotion to God. Was this a cruel jest, a terrible mistake? Yet the voice had been clear, the command unmistakable. In the silence of his tent, surrounded by his sleeping household, Abraham had to make a choice. He had to decide whether his faith was strong enough to obey even when he could not understand, to trust even when his heart was breaking into 1,000 pieces. The weight of this decision was immense, a burden too heavy for any man to bear alone. By the time the first light of dawn painted the eastern sky, Abraham had made his decision. He would obey. He would place his trust in God, even if it meant walking through the valley of the deepest shadow. He rose early, his movements deliberate and heavy with unspoken grief. He did not wake Sarah or explain the terrible purpose of his journey. He simply began the preparations, his actions speaking of a faith that was resolute, a trust that was absolute, even in the face of an unthinkable, terrifying command that defied all human reason and paternal love. With the first rays of the morning sun casting long shadows across the land, Abraham began his preparations. He saddled his donkey, the familiar task now feeling strange and heavy. He called two of his trusted servants to accompany them, their presence a small comfort, on a journey shrouded in secrecy and sorrow. Then he went to his son. Isaac, young and full of life, was likely excited for a journey with his father. Abraham gathered the wood for the burnt offering, splitting it himself, each strike of the axe a painful echo of the purpose for which it was intended. He packed provisions for the road, his hands moving with a mechanical steadiness that betrayed the turmoil in his soul. The journey began. It was a long and arduous walk that stretched over 3 days. For 3 days, Abraham walked side by side with the son he was commanded to sacrifice. The silence between them must have been profound, filled with unspoken questions and unexpressed grief. Abraham looked at his son, at his youthful energy and innocent trust, and his heart must have ached with every step. He saw the boy who was his joy, his legacy, and the promise of a nation, and yet he continued to walk toward the mountain God had appointed, his resolve unwavering even as his paternal love tore him apart. As they traveled, Isaac, in his innocence, likely saw this as a special time with his father. He may have asked questions about the landscape, about the animals they saw, or about the purpose of their long trek. Abraham would have answered, his voice perhaps strained, his mind elsewhere. How does a father speak of everyday things when his heart is carrying the heaviest secret imaginable? Every kind word, every shared glance would have been a fresh wound, a reminder of what he was being asked to give up. The two servants who walked with them knew nothing, seeing only a father and son on a religious pilgrimage. On the third day, Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place in the distance. The mountain stood against the sky, waiting. He turned to his servants and said, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." The words "we will come back" hung in the air, a statement of faith that defied the very task he was setting out to complete. He then laid the wood for the offering on Isaac's shoulders, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. And so the two of them, father and son, walked on together toward their destiny on the lonely mountain. As they ascended the slopes of the mountain, the weight of the wood on Isaac's shoulders was nothing compared to the weight on Abraham's heart. The air grew thinner, and the silence between them became more pronounced. Finally, Isaac broke the silence with a simple, piercing question that must have felt like a knife in his father's soul. "Father," he asked, his voice clear and trusting. "Yes, my son," Abraham replied, bracing himself. "The fire and wood are here," Isaac observed, looking around. "But where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" The innocence of the question was devastating, cutting straight to the core of Abraham's hidden agony. Abraham's reply was a testament to his profound and desperate faith. He looked at his beloved son and spoke words that were both a prophecy and a prayer. "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." He could not bring himself to reveal the horrifying truth. Yet his answer spoke of a deeper trust that, even in this darkest moment, God would remain faithful to his nature. They continued their climb, Isaac seemingly satisfied with the answer, his trust in his father complete. Abraham, however, walked with the knowledge that unless God intervened, his own son was the intended sacrifice. When they reached the place God had shown him, Abraham's movements became slow and deliberate, each action a step of pure obedience. He began to build an altar, gathering stones from the rocky ground and carefully placing one on top of the other. His hands, which had so often held his son in loving embrace, were now constructing the very platform for his sacrifice. He then arranged the wood on the altar, preparing the pyre with methodical precision. All the while Isaac watched, his young eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and perhaps a growing sense of unease. The reality of the situation was slowly dawning, yet he did not resist. With the altar ready, the most dreadful moment arrived. Abraham turned to his son. With a heart breaking with a love deeper than any ocean, he bound Isaac's hands and feet. The scriptures do not record a struggle. They show only a son's quiet trust and a father's sorrowful obedience. He gently lifted Isaac and laid him on the altar, on top of the wood. All was now in place. Abraham stood over his son, the son of the promise, the child of his laughter. He reached out his trembling hand and took the knife, the cold metal, a stark contrast to the warmth of his love, and raised it to slay his son. In that final, suspended moment, as Abraham's arm was raised and his will was surrendered completely to God's command, a voice shattered the terrible silence. "Abraham, Abraham," it was the angel of the Lord calling out from heaven. The sound was urgent, stopping the knife in midair. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," the angel commanded. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." A wave of relief so immense it must have buckled Abraham's knees, washed over him. His son was safe. The test was over. Abraham, his eyes likely filled with tears of relief and gratitude, lowered the knife and quickly untied his son, holding him in a desperate, loving embrace. At that moment, he looked up and saw something caught in a nearby thicket. It was a ram, its horns tangled in the dense branches. It was the sacrifice, the lamb that God himself had provided, just as Abraham had told Isaac he would. His words of faith had become a reality. He had been willing to give up everything for God, and in return, God had provided exactly what was needed at the perfect moment, sparing his beloved son. With a heart overflowing with thankfulness, Abraham took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering on the altar instead of his son. He named that place, "The Lord will provide." And for generations to come, people would speak of that mountain as the place where God's provision was made clear. The ordeal had been a profound and terrifying test of faith, but its resolution was an even more profound demonstration of God's mercy and faithfulness. Abraham had proven that his love for God was ultimate, and God, in turn, had proven that his promises could be trusted completely. The story of Abraham and Isaac on Mount Moriah echoes through the ages as a timeless lesson in faith and trust. It teaches us that true faith is not about understanding God's ways, but about trusting his heart. Even when his commands seem impossible and his path is shrouded in mystery, it shows that God sees our willingness to obey and honors the faith that is willing to surrender everything to him. Abraham's journey, from receiving the promise under the stars to laying his son on the altar, remains one of the most powerful testaments to the belief that God is always faithful and will always provide for those who trust in him.